Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Cape Perpetua Speaker Series. My name is Tara Du Bois, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Cape Perpetua Collaborative, and it's a pleasure to coordinate this series. Today we'll be hearing from Rachel Wheat. She will be talking about linking landscapes for wildlife and the Oregon Connectivity Assessment and Mapping Project. And our next presentation, instead of next Saturday, it's going to be this coming Thursday, December 16th at 3:30 p.m. And we'll be hearing from Max Nielsen Pincus and Keegan Scully Engelmeyer on the public perceptions of coastal resources and marine protected areas. A little bit about our land acknowledgement. The Cape Perpetua area landscape from Yachats to Florence is the traditional territory of the Siletz tribe and the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw tribe. And we want to acknowledge the tribal governments and their roles historically and today in taking care of these lands. And you can find out more information about these two tribes on their respective websites. A little bit about the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. The Collaborative's vision is to foster conservation and collaboration within local communities for scientific exchange, management, awareness, and stewardship from the land to the sea in and around the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve. We've got three guiding principles that guide our work, and they are community engagement, leveraging resources, and engaging in partnerships. And you can see the logos here at the bottom of this slide. And these are our founding partners who brought the collaborative together about 4 years ago. But we also have a variety of local partners, business partners, other agencies, some nonprofits, in addition to these. And I just like to acknowledge that we couldn't do our work without our partners. As I mentioned before, our focus is in and around the Marine Reserve. The Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve is Oregon's largest marine reserve. And in addition to the marine protected areas to the north and south, there's some form of protected water that stretches between Yachats and Florence. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the management agency of Oregon's marine reserves. And you can see a variety of pictures here on the screen that have been taken during their research. Gives you an idea of what you'd find if you take a dive under the water or a trip to the tide pools. We also host a variety of community science at Cape Perpetua, in the Cape Perpetua area. Many of them are seasonal, but we also host monthly beach cleanups. And our BioBlitz is an ongoing thing that you can also do year round that you can join through iNaturalist. And in addition to this speaker series, we also host a Young Scientist webinar series. That's the second Tuesday of the month, October through April. And our next one's coming up this Tuesday. And you can find out more information about all of the community science and an events calendar on our website at capeperpetuacollaborative.org. And I always like to encourage folks to please connect with us on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And if you feel inclined and you like what we're doing, do feel free to donate. If you go to our website, there's a donate button at the top and the bottom of the site. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Rachel Wheat. She serves as the Wildlife Connectivity Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Her background is in quantitative spatial statistics and spatial modeling of wildlife movement and habitat. Prior to coming to Oregon, Rachel worked as a postdoctoral research associate with the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry and the New York Department of Environmental Conservation on the spatial ecology of moose, white-tailed deer, and coyotes in upstate New York. She earned her PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz, with work focused on the movement and behavioral ecology of bald eagles and brown bears in Alaska. And Rachel is based out of the agency's headquarters in Salem, Oregon. And Rachel, I will stop sharing now, so you're welcome to pull your screen up. And just want to mention as Rachel pops up her presentation to please feel free to add any questions that you have throughout her presentation to the chat or the Q&A box. And we will do a Q&A session after the presentation. And with that, Rachel, you can take it over.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to stop my video because it tends to slow down my internet while I'm also presenting. So, as Sarah said, my name is Rachel. I'm the Wildlife Connectivity Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I work in our Wildlife Division at ODFW in our conservation program. And my role within the agency is to analyze spatial data and coordinate efforts statewide to identify, enhance, and protect connectivity for wildlife. So my goals when putting together the talk for today was to give an overview of connectivity modeling that's meant to be accessible to those who maybe aren't super familiar with ecology or wildlife biology. So there's going to be a lot of science, but I've tried to make it as understandable as possible. One other thing to note up front is that I don't work with fish. So we're not considering any fish species in this project. It's not that fish don't have connectivity issues or we don't think fish are important. It's just the way that ODFW is structured and organized separates fish from wildlife. So we have a separate fish division that works on fish passage issues. And the wildlife funding structure doesn't permit us to include consideration of fish in this particular effort. So let's start off with the basics. What are we talking about when we're talking about wildlife connectivity? Ecologically, connectivity is a measure of how well the landscape facilitates or impedes movement. Now that could be movement of an individual animal, it could be movement of a population, it could be some movement of some sort of ecological process. Now, obviously our focus here is wildlife, so we're looking at the factors that are influencing how permeable the landscape is for wildlife or how easy it is for wildlife to move. Here in Oregon, our growth rate ranks in the top 10 in the nation. And our population is expected to exceed 4.6 million by 2025. And that growth is putting a lot of demand on our state's infrastructure. Things like roads, electrical lines, freshwater, housing. And that, of course, leads to things like new residential and commercial development, new houses and apartment buildings and shopping centers, new roadways, increased traffic volumes, new energy development, things like solar and wind, and increased resource extraction, logging and mining and agriculture. And all those things affect the ability of wildlife to move across the landscape to meet their daily and seasonal needs. We're also dealing with the effects of a changing climate, which can lead to things like extended droughts, more frequent and high intensity storms, more frequent and high intensity wildfires. And all of those things also change the landscape and affect wildlife movement. So probably the single best example of the loss of connectivity for most people is roadkill. I would challenge anyone to argue that they have never seen the carcass of some sort of animal, a deer or skunk or raccoon or bird while driving. And these road-killed wildlife were all trying to get from one place to another. Their habitat was fragmented by a road, and then they were struck and killed by vehicles when trying to get to different parts of their habitat. But the effects of connectivity loss extend well beyond just roadkill or direct mortality. Habitat loss and fragmentation can impact wildlife's access to suitable forage, so all the things they need to eat. It can prevent access to breeding areas for successful reproduction and can have behavioral impacts that disrupt a species' ability to find food and shelter. So these issues are obviously a major concern, and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife recognizes this as a priority for wildlife conservation in the state. So each state in the United States has what's called a state wildlife action plan. And these state wildlife action plans function as overarching state strategies for conserving fish and wildlife and their habitats. Oregon's state wildlife action plan is called the Oregon Conservation Strategy. And the strategy identifies 7 key conservation issues, which are landscape level threats to the state species and their habitats. One of those threats is loss of habitat connectivity, which is captured in a key conservation issue called barriers to animal movement. Connectivity is also a significant component of a few other key conservation issues, including climate change, land use change, and water quality and quantity. So as an agency, ODFW is tasked with managing the state's fish and wildlife populations. But I think it's important to note that it's not just ODFW that's working with wildlife or that has an interest in working to help keep wildlife connected. So there's a number of organizations throughout Oregon that are dedicated to improving wildlife connectivity. The organizations that you see here are all part of a group known as the Oregon Habitat Connectivity Consortium. And this group was founded in 2016 to foster information sharing and collaboration toward identifying and enhancing connectivity for wildlife, or habitat connectivity generally. So while there are instances throughout the state of local areas that have identified connectivity needs for individual species, more broadly in Oregon, we really lack information on where wildlife connectivity is intact, where connectivity is functioned but threatened, and where it's been cut off completely and needs to be restored. So through the collaboration of the groups in that Oregon Habitat Connectivity Consortium, we developed a plan for a massive statewide effort to identify priority wildlife habitat in Oregon. The Oregon Connectivity Assessment and Mapping Project, or OCAMP for short, and I probably refer to it as OCAMP throughout the rest of the talk. So this is a multi-year, multi-institution project toward mapping priority wildlife corridors for 54 of Oregon's wildlife species. All 54 species were selected to represent the needs of the diversity of wildlife in Oregon. So the ultimate goal of OCAMP is to produce a map highlighting priority wildlife movement corridors in Oregon that can be used both internally by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and externally by other wildlife conservation and land management organizations to help target things like conservation action, habitat enhancement and restoration, barrier removal, and transportation mitigation, all with the aim of improving wildlife connectivity in the state. So ODFW is directing this effort. We are working pretty closely with Portland State University and a consulting group out of Portland called Samara Group, because it is a massive project. The work involved in OCAMP is both intensive and extensive, but I'll touch on a few key points in the process. We officially started work in December of 2019, and we expect to have our connectivity maps complete for all of our species by December of 2022. We'll probably need some time after that to get all of our products together and get them ready for release to the public. And we're anticipating that we'll have our products freely available online probably in late winter, early spring 2023. So I thought it might be helpful to take a quick look at our project workflow to try to help provide a sense of all the moving parts in this project and how they're interconnected. So I recommend try not to get too bogged down in the details. This is mostly an illustration of the scale of the project and what it takes to get from sort of raw data on one end to a usable end product, which is this map of priority corridors. We have numerous high-level milestones, and those are displayed here as the solid colored boxes at the top of the chart. Each of those milestones has numerous parts, and those are listed here in chronological order from the bottom of the chart to the top. So not all of the pieces are included in this chart, but it should give folks the general picture. The boxes that are shaded are those that we've completed in entirety. And so that for now is just the surrogate species selection. And all the boxes that have bold outlines are steps that we're currently working on. So we're pretty far into this project. The only pieces that we really haven't started working on tend to be some of those final steps to put all the maps for the different species together and create that final prioritized corridors map. So one really important thing to note before we get into the weeds here is that connectivity is species specific. The landscape looks very differently to, say, something like a frog that's small and needs access to water and doesn't move around a lot than it does to maybe a bird, a woodpecker that uses tree cavities and needs access to trees for food and can fly, so more highly mobile. And then both of those species are going to perceive the landscape differently and move differently throughout their environments than something like, let's say, pronghorn. That uses open sagebrush landscapes, and they run really fast and they travel hundreds of kilometers to find food sometimes. But as you saw in the picture at the beginning of the talk, they struggle with fencing. So what is considered good habitat for one species might be considered impermeable habitat to another species. So it's really important when we're identifying these priority connectivity areas to take into account a really broad diversity of species and all of their respective needs. So the habitats with which they're associated, the features on the landscape that could impede their movement, the movement and dispersal capabilities of the individual species, and then how all of those features might change in the future, either through habitat loss or changes in land use, or maybe shifts in habitat due to climate change. So our species selection process took this need for diversity into account. To begin with, we wanted all of our species to act as surrogates. Oregon has more than 700 species of wildlife, and it's obviously impossible for us to model connectivity for all of those species. So surrogate species are selected as representatives of broader suites of habitat associations and habitat needs. So in the process of using these species as surrogates, we assess connectivity not only for an individual species, but we know the needs of that species encompass the needs of other similar species as well, meaning that our final connectivity models will be more representative of wildlife in Oregon as a whole. We want to make sure that each selection represents a specific habitat association or habitat structural characteristic, and also that our full suite of species represents a diversity of taxa, of life history strategies, of movement capabilities, and sensitivity to anthropogenic threats, both in terms of barriers to species movement and also in terms of some of those long-term threats to persistence, again, like climate change. So we started by creating a list of all of Oregon's wildlife species and their respective habitat associations. And then we ran a cluster analysis to group species based on those habitat associations and the strength of the relationship between the species and the habitat. We filtered out non-native species, marine species, and migratory birds that do not breed in Oregon. And then we broke species down into groups based on ecoregions. We created scoring workbooks to help evaluate each candidate's suitability for connectivity modeling, taking into consideration things like the extent to which we understand the species habitat requirements, the extent to which the species might serve as a good surrogate for others, the species habitat associations, mobility, sensitivity to things like development and traffic on roadways. And we also took into consideration data availability. And then we shopped out these scoring workbooks to a bunch of biologists and practitioners across the state, and we asked them to help provide their expertise in scoring our candidate species based on all those criteria. So once scoring was complete, we held a series of workshops that were broken down by ecoregion. And we asked the folks that had participated in the scoring process or the folks that worked with these candidate species to join us in these workshops and basically discuss the relative merits of each of our candidates and narrow down our list to the final representatives for each ecoregion in question. So this took place during, we had one workshop that took place as a pilot in spring of 2019. The other workshops took place in spring of 2020. We had intended to have them in person, but of course, that was the beginning of the pandemic. And so we ended up holding them remotely. But ultimately, we had participation from more than 50 biologists and practitioners in the species selection process. And they represented different state and federal organizations, as well as nonprofits and NGOs. So we were pretty pleased with the amount of work or the amount of participation that we were able to get in choosing our species for this project. And here's what we ended up with. So we selected 54 species in Oregon to assess for OCAMP, 23 mammals, 16 birds, 8 amphibians, 4 reptiles, and 3 invertebrates. And all of these represent different habitat types and movement availabilities, and definite bonus points to anyone who can name them all just by looking at these pictures. I have a list of the species later on that we can take a look at if folks are a little overwhelmed by trying to figure out which individual species we have just based on these photos. One of our primary considerations when selecting species was ensuring that we represented the geography of Oregon as a whole with each taxa across the state. So each species, of course, has their own range in Oregon. And we wanted to make sure that for our amphibians, our birds, our mammals, and our reptiles, that the ranges of the species that we selected covered the geographic extent of Oregon. So if we look just at our selected amphibians, we can see how well we accomplished that goal. So we have northern red-legged frog in the west here, and we also have coastal tailed frog in the west. We have foothill yellow-legged frog in the southwest, so the west is pretty well covered. In the central part of the state, we have Cascades frog, and we have Oregon slender salamander. And then in the eastern part of the state, we have Columbia spotted frog. And then we have 2 additional amphibians that have distributions that cover most of the state, and that's long-toed salamander and western toad. So altogether, those 8 amphibians that we selected do a pretty good job at covering the entire geography of Oregon. And the same, of course, is true for our other taxa, especially the birds and the mammals, who have typically larger distributions in the state. And of course, we selected many more of them. So I know this collaborative is largely focused on the Oregon coast, obviously Cape Perpetua area. So many of our species have distributions that extend out to or fall on or near the coast, but we did specifically select 8 species to represent the Coast Range ecoregion. And those are northern flying squirrel, American beaver, Townsend's chipmunk, Pacific martin, snowy plover, wren tit, and Pacific slip flycatcher, and then northern red-legged frog. So as I mentioned earlier, I know it's difficult to tell which species we picked based on those photos. So we'll go ahead and cheat and I'll show you the names. We ended up breaking our species into 12 groups, and each of these groups represents a common habitat association. So we'll assess each of these species needs independently to ensure that we're identifying priority areas and representing the needs of all of Oregon's wildlife, but we broke them into species groups just to make processing a little bit more tractable. So group 1, a few species that are largely associated with the Coast Range. These were our pilot species. We got some seed funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they were particularly interested in these 3 species. Group 2, we went to the opposite side of the state for our sage steppe associates. Group 3 are our large-bodied habitat generalists. Group 4 are oak associates. Group 5 are open water and riparian associates. Group 6 are meadow associates. Group 7 here is old growth associates. Group 8 is kind of a hodgepodge of species that have fairly unique habitat associations. So for example, coastal tailed frog are associated with headwater streams, and long-nosed leopard lizard are associated with desert playa and salt scrub. And those are habitats that aren't really well represented by other species in our assessment. Group 9 is our alpine associates. Group 10 is a repeat of essentially the first group, our mixed conifer hardwood associates. Group 11 is a repeat of the second group, our sage steppe associates, and then group 12 is associates with early seral structure forests. And the species in group 10 and 11 and 12 are all species for which we're relatively data poor. So one of the predominant milestones in this project is to validate our models wherever we can. And in order to validate the models, we need occurrence data for species. And the species that we ended up putting in these last 3 groups are all species for which we don't have a ton of occurrence data. So we were hoping that pushing them to the end of the project would give us a little bit more time to try to accumulate as much data on these species as we possibly could. So for each of these species, we need to assess their need. And the first step in that assessment is to build what's called a habitat permeability model for each species. And this model is going to illustrate which parts of the landscape are easier or more difficult for species to move through. So we construct these models using geospatial data. We use a geographic information system to put these layers together. And in this particular project, we're using a software tool called ArcMap. And each of these data layers has a spatial resolution of 30 meters. So we're looking at little pixels of 30 by 30 meters. So we have a pretty fine spatial resolution. So for each of these 54 species, we use information from peer-reviewed literature from scientific journals, as well as any existing habitat models. And we really look to try to determine what each species needs to move throughout its environment. So what are their habitat needs? And then we try to gather spatial data that we can use to represent those habitat needs in this model. So for example, we might know that a species is closely tied to wetland habitat. Maybe they don't ever move more than 500 meters from a wetland. And so in that case, we would potentially use the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wetlands Index, and then we would cut that layer down to nothing more than 500 meters from wetlands, and that would be one layer in this habitat permeability model. So I have some other examples here with the National Land Cover Database, Oregon statewide habitat map, things like OpenStreetMaps and ODOT's data on highways. So in all cases, we try to figure out what are the things that are most important for the species habitat needs, and then how do we represent those using spatial data that we have access to. When that process is completed and we stack all of these layers together and identify the components from each layer that are more or less important to a given species, we construct a habitat permeability model that looks something like this. So this is an example for pronghorn. And in this model, the darker greens are representing areas that are expected to be more permeable for pronghorn. So these are areas with things like high quality sagebrush habitat and good visibility and close proximity to water. And then the lighter greens and the yellows on this map represent habitats that might be more difficult for pronghorn to move through. Areas where potentially there's canopy cover or agricultural fields that maybe are surrounded by fencing. It's also a little bit difficult to see at this scale, but there are some areas in the map that are in gray, and those represent barriers to pronghorn movement, places that we wouldn't ever expect pronghorn to be able to go or to move through, like alpine areas or maybe city centers. So this permeability map is going to form the foundation for our connectivity model. Areas that are more permeable are easier for a species to move through, and then less permeable areas are more likely to impede connectivity. So one really important thing to note here is the use of habitat permeability as the driving characteristic of this model. So we're really focused on wildlife movement in this project. And we know that wildlife will often move through otherwise unsuitable habitat when they're really motivated, like when animals are migrating or when juvenile animals are dispersing into new territories. So we want to make sure that we're capturing that in our final statewide priorities corridor map. So for anyone on the call that does happen to be more familiar with ecology or wildlife biology, these habitat permeability models are much less conservative than a traditional species distribution model or a habitat suitability model, because we're really viewing the landscape through the lens of movement. So a critical step in this process of identifying these important areas for wildlife connectivity is validation. So these are models of habitat permeability. I keep using this word models. We're trying to do our best to represent the habitats the species will use, but we have to use approximations or proxies in order to do so. We're using the best available data that we have, things like the newest possible spatial data sets, and we're using published literature from peer-reviewed research on each of these species that's providing this background information on how we should categorize things like land cover type and landscape features and barriers to movement. But unless we go through that extra step to evaluate the accuracy of the way that we've categorized these different layers, we can't really be sure whether our data accurately represent the species needs or not. Ecological systems are super messy and complicated, and we're never going to get it exactly right. So in essence, these models are hypotheses regarding where we expect movement for a given species to be facilitated or impeded. And then validation is the process that helps us test whether our hypotheses are on the right track or not. So in this project, we're evaluating our models in two ways. The first is to have species experts review our models to see if our categorizations align with the experts' understanding of things like the literature and the species biology, or maybe the expert's own work and experience. So we provide our draft habitat permeability models to biologists, ecologists, conservation practitioners that all work with the species, and they help us by reviewing the maps and the data that we use to build them, so that they can flag areas of the maps that don't look right, or maybe ways that the input layers have been categorized that don't align with their understanding of the species needs. Sometimes they might even point out that we're missing data. So for example, maybe a particular type of shrub is very important to the species, but we haven't included that in our models. Or maybe they'll identify a higher quality data set that we can use that we hadn't found before. And then we go back and we add in that, that data to the model to make sure that those habitats are represented. So this is a super small example of that review process. This map shows part of the draft habitat permeability model that I showed for pronghorn before, again in Southern Oregon. This is near the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. The color scheme is the same as on the previous slide, with the dark greens representing highly permeable habitat and the yellows representing low permeability. And then we have this polygon on the map now in this aquamarine color. And that is an area of the model showing that pronghorn should have moderate or high permeability in this area, but one of our species experts noted that they don't think pronghorn are ever going to be found there. So then we take that feedback into consideration and we try to determine why. So maybe there's something in the way that we've built our model that's artificially inflating the permeability for pronghorn in the area that we need to adjust. Or maybe we need to adjust the species range boundary. Maybe there's no way that pronghorn would be found there anyway. Or maybe there's a barrier somewhere that's preventing pronghorn from accessing what would otherwise be suitable habitat. So we try to get a minimum of 3 species experts to review each of these models. They provide feedback, and then we try to incorporate that feedback where we can into improving the model overall. Once we've identified the problem and we made those model adjustments, we move on to a formal validation process using empirical data on species occurrence. So many organizations, including the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, various universities, and then even community science platforms like eBird and iNaturalist, they're all collecting data points where different species have been observed. So some of these data are collected during formal surveys or during research efforts or during monitoring, where scientists are actively out searching for the species in question. But some are collected incidentally when maybe someone's out working or recreating and just happens to see an animal and records the sighting. But in any case, if we have an accurate GPS location of the animal, a date, and a positive identification of the species, then we can use those points to help validate our models. So we're sticking with our pronghorn model here. The magenta circles are representing places where pronghorn were actually observed. So we know that pronghorn were there. And then if we recall that our habitat permeability models are intended to represent how easy it is for pronghorn to move, we know that if we're doing a good job at representing the pronghorn's habitat needs with this model, then we'd expect that the species is going to be found more often in those highly permeable habitats and less often in the less permeable habitats. And then we'd also expect that pronghorn are never going to be found in those areas in gray that we've classified as being totally impermeable to pronghorn movement. So we take our empirical species occurrence data and we overlay it on top of our maps, and we use statistical validation techniques to identify how well we've done in classifying different parts of the landscape. And if we find areas where the habitat permeability model is saying permeability is low, but the occurrence data say that lots of pronghorn have been observed at that site, we know we haven't done a great job at classifying the habitat, and we need to go back and try to figure out how to make changes to the model to make it fit better. So this formal validation process, along with the initial model review by species experts, help us ensure that our habitat permeability models will help us accurately model connectivity. So since we're building the model to illustrate how permeable or impermeable we expect the landscape to be for a given species, we can use these permeability maps to figure out where the species is most likely to move. And that's the tie-in to the connectivity part. So sometimes I find this easiest to start with a conceptual example, kind of like a thought exercise. How do we model wildlife movement? Well, let's think about taking maybe a ball to a top of a hill and letting the ball roll down the hill. The ball is naturally going to move downhill along the path of least resistance. So areas that are smoother will mean the ball is going to move more quickly. Areas that are maybe muddy or bumpy might slow the ball down. And then probably there's obstacles on the hill as well. So if the ball runs into a rock, maybe it rolls around one side or the other. If the ball encounters a small stick, maybe it just rolls right over it. But if the stick is too large, the ball might stop completely. And in some ways, we can think of wildlife movement as being similar to this sort of conceptual exercise of the ball on the hill. Because wildlife are naturally going to want to move across the landscape wherever it's easiest for them based on their habitat needs. And wildlife encounter obstacles as well. So some of those obstacles they can get around, some of the obstacles they can get over or across, and then some obstacles are just going to stop them altogether. So with our habitat permeability models, we've taken those things into consideration by mapping some habitats as having high permeability and some as having low permeability and some as being barriers to movement. We just need something to act like the ball to move throughout the landscape and show us where those easiest pathways to travel are going to be. And the way we do this, believe it or not, is using electrical current. So we treat the landscape like a giant electrical circuit. We use our habitat permeability model to assign a resistance value to each cell on the landscape. Cells in the permeability model that have habitat that's expected to facilitate the movement of the species are assigned low resistance values. And cells in the permeability model that are expected to impede movement of the species are assigned high resistance values. And then the cells in the permeability model that are barriers to the species movement are treated as breaks in the circuit. And then essentially we inject electrical current into the landscape, and the current will flow across the landscape based on the resistance of each cell. And the flow of this current ends up being our proxy for animal movement. So in the same way that we expect wildlife to move more readily through highly permeable habitat, electrical current will move more readily through areas with low resistance. And the output is a map illustrating current density, which essentially represents how often we expect a species to select that habitat area to move through. So the output of one of these models looks like this. Here we're looking at an example for Western rattlesnake. The bright yellow colors in this example are areas where that current density is highest. So these are areas where the movement of Western rattlesnake is expected to be more intense. If we go back to our example with the ball, these would be the areas on the hill that were smooth, that allowed the ball to roll freely. Areas that are less resistant to movement. And then the darker, more purple areas are areas that have higher resistance, where we'd expect less movement of Western rattlesnake. So maybe the habitat just isn't quite right for a rattlesnake there, or maybe there's obstacles that the rattlesnake can't travel through. So you can see in this example how the habitat permeability model on the left relates to that connectivity model on the right. All that work that we've put into building this permeability model is going to make our connectivity model more successful. So all of those dark greens in the habitat permeability model on the left are the areas that show up as those bright orange or yellow in the connectivity model, those areas that have a higher current flow because the resistance to movement through those areas is lower. Now, models like these can be fairly difficult to interpret, especially when it comes to trying to identify these discrete priority movement corridors for targeted conservation action, like habitat restoration or protection. So the next step is to take the output of these connectivity models and to start to refine them. So here's another example, output of a connectivity model on the left for mule deer. And the color scheme is pretty much the same as the previous slide. Those orangey yellows are the areas where we expect more mule deer movement, and the blue areas are areas where we expect less mule deer movement. This is a part of the landscape just north of Redmond, and you can see Highway 97 is bisecting the study area north to south. But essentially what we're doing is we are pulling out areas that are the most important for connectivity for each species. So if we focus only on the highest current flow areas, we pull out those to look specifically at parts of the landscape that are particularly important for mule deer. Or focusing on things like bottlenecked areas of the current flow or movement, where it's really important that those habitats are not lost, so we don't lose connectivity for the species. So we go through this whole process, building the permeability models, validating the models, running our circuit models to illustrate connectivity for each of those 54 species that we selected for our assessment. And again, these 54 species were selected as surrogates for specific habitat associations and structural habitat characteristics, with the intent to represent all of Oregon's wildlife as a whole. So if we combine each species' high priority connectivity areas, we can start to get a better sense for connectivity of wildlife as a whole. So to the important areas for the mule deer from the previous slide in yellow, we add the highest current flow areas for a second species in blue. This is a riparian associated species. And then we add the highest current flow areas for a third species in green and a fourth species in orange. And this allows us to start identifying patterns that can be used in prioritizing where conservation work is needed the most. So for example, in the left-hand oval on this slide is a location where high current flow for 3 different species overlap. And this is going to be a potential target area for working with our partners to ensure that that connection is not lost. Maybe that occurs through a conservation easement. Maybe that occurs through removal of old dilapidated fencing that could hamper wildlife movement, or retrofitting of existing fencing to be more wildlife friendly. Maybe there's habitat improvements that occur at this site through the removal of invasive vegetation. The other location on the right is an area where we see these high movement areas for 3 species being bottlenecked. And those 3 pathways are narrowing and crossing Highway 97. And so that could be a target for working with the Oregon Department of Transportation to consider some sort of wildlife crossing structure over or under the roadway at that site that could help prevent wildlife vehicle collisions. So when we're trying to prioritize these important areas for wildlife movement and define specific wildlife corridors, we need to take numerous factors into consideration. Not only just these areas where corridors for multiple species overlap, but also maybe overlap with or proximity to protected lands, things like land ownership, bottlenecks in connectivity for different species, and then things like development pressures. So additionally, we're going to be taking climate change into consideration by incorporating information on geophysically diverse areas that are expected to be climate resilient. So in the process of identifying our priority wildlife corridors, we want to make sure that those overlap in as much as they can with climate resilient areas that can hopefully help facilitate the movement or the shift in species range boundaries over time. So ultimately, these products from this Oregon Connectivity Assessing and Mapping project are intended to highlight these statewide priorities for enhancing and protecting connectivity for Oregon's wildlife. The Priority Wildlife Corridors Map is intended to be a public tool for use both within the ODFW, but then also outside the agency to help mitigate some of these demands of Oregon's growing population. We want to inform land use development and permitting for renewable energy development, and to help guide granting efforts and to target areas that are in need of restoration or protection. We want to help prevent those wildlife vehicle collisions and help inform the planning processes and operations of other organizations, especially organizations that manage wildlife habitat. Because even though ODFW is responsible for managing wildlife in Oregon, we don't manage habitat outside of the wildlife areas that ODFW owns. And so it can be a real struggle sometimes for us trying to conserve a species when we really rely on the work of our other partners to do the habitat management and protection for us. It looks like we have plenty of time for questions. I do want to mention that if folks are interested in learning more about the Oregon Conservation Strategy, which again is Oregon State Wildlife Action Plan, I encourage you to visit OregonConservationStrategy.org. We have information on all of our species of greatest conservation need, as well as our key conservation issues there. And there is a webpage specifically about this project that can provide some additional information, as well as the opportunity to sign up for a listserv if you're interested in learning more about the project over time and progress and when the products are publicly available. And then I can be reached at the below email address if folks have other questions or concerns that they want to follow up on after this talk. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was great. So we had one question pop in, but I want to just encourage folks to go ahead and put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to those. And while folks are doing that, I always like to ask, what was your inspiration for kind of niching down into this topic and working on a project like this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's twofold. I was drawn to this particular position because I've always had an interest in wildlife movement. I mean, from a young age, it seemed like a great mystery to me. Like, how do we figure, what are wildlife doing out there? We encounter them from time to time, but then this idea that they have their own lives that they lead, and they're going about their days and they're visiting different areas, and where are they going and why? So that was a big driving factor behind my educational process and why I was particularly interested in this position. The driving factors behind this project as a whole are really that we are in desperate need of this information for the state of Oregon. We do not currently have great information on wildlife connectivity for most species in Oregon. We do have a couple situations where we have fairly fine resolution GPS tracking data for, say, mule deer, but those are a limited portion of the species range, and it's obviously just one species out of many. And so as Oregon continues to grow and we continue to have these development pressures, we really, really desperately need information on where wildlife connectivity is the most important to be able to ensure that wildlife can continue moving throughout their habitats, because that's one of the main drivers behind biodiversity loss is habitat fragmentation. Mm-hmm. The better we link our landscapes, the better we are able to preserve our existing species.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that'll get more challenging as population continues to increase and we continue to build out things. So it's a great project. Glad to see it happening. So we have a question here. The permeability model and connectivity model seem to produce nearly the same map. seems like the permeability map can serve as the connectivity map. Can you explain the difference again and why you need to do both?
Right, they can appear very similar. And Western rattlesnake is probably not the best example. It's just one of the few for which we have a connectivity map on hand. But essentially, there are some differences, especially where barriers are concerned. So the permeability map just shows, say there's a highway that's acting as a strict barrier for a species. The permeability map would show high permeable habitat on one side and high permeability map of habitat on the other side, but it wouldn't show the connection between those two areas. And so if we're looking at things like transportation mitigation, we would want to know where are animals most likely to try and cross that highway. And that's not something that we would get from the permeability model. So the benefit of the connectivity model is that as that electrical current is flowing through the landscape, it's going to indicate which areas along that highway are more or less likely to be selected as a site to try to cross the highway. And then those are the areas that we can start to look at more closely as potential sites for transportation mitigation. Now that's just one.
So, oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, you can. I was just saying, that's just one example of how the connectivity model is going to differ from the permeability model. Western rattlesnake has shorter movements than some other species, but we do see pretty significant differences sometimes with our species that are more highly mobile because they're flowing over a much greater area. So sometimes we see connections across less suitable habitat. So it's not a perfect mirror between that permeability and the connectivity model in those cases.
So kind of along that same line, would this project then recommend, like, say, at places where the connectivity crosses the highway, or you need some sort of movement for wildlife across the highway? Would this project then recommend like a land bridge or something like that, where, if the highway's already there, so you can't really redirect it, to add a route for wildlife?
Yeah, that's the idea, is that, we want to keep wildlife moving. We want to reduce things like wildlife vehicle collisions. We want to link habitats that have been severed by development in whatever form it might take. And so if we see a scenario where we have the connectivity routes for multiple species all attempting to cross a given linear infrastructure at a certain location, then we would absolutely approach the Oregon Department of Transportation and say, hey, we got to do something about this. And the most effective forms of transportation mitigation have been things like overpasses and underpasses, specifically designed and built for wildlife. So that would be the ultimate goal. We've struggled with the Oregon Department of Transportation getting them to fund these types of projects in the past, but that's the aim, certainly.
Which leads to one of the questions: how stable is the funding for this project?
We have this project entirely funded, so we will be fine to finish this project. In terms of the implementation of the work, that kind of remains to be seen. And again, I mentioned we really rely on our partners, our other state and federal organizations and other nonprofits and NGOs to do habitat management. And so since ODFW doesn't manage habitat, then, our idea is that we put this information out there and then we encourage folks to do some of those on the ground conservation actions or restoration actions that are needed to help facilitate wildlife movement. And so the project is funded. The implementation is kind of up to, it is up to ODFW in some extent, but it's also up to our partners as well.
Do you anticipate that ODFW will do something similar for fish?
So ODFW has a fish passage program that is actually enormously well funded because they get a lot of federal funding for salmon. And it's also legally mandated that they take fish passage into account whenever there is a project around roadways or development or anything like that. So any type of development that occurs, folks are required to take fish passage into account, especially where there's potential salmonid passage. This information already exists for fish. It's constantly being updated. There's constantly being projects that are working to improve fish passage. We're just way behind on the wildlife side.
Can you speak about the loss of interior forest habitat conditions and forest management, such as like edge effect recommendations to improve potential recovery of interior forest species?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
So I guess could be around the edge effects recommendations. So maybe, Paul, you'll have to let me know this is your question if I'm hitting it right. Maybe like buffer zones or things like that, maybe.
Can you read it again one more time?
Yeah. Can you speak about the loss of interior forest habitat conditions and forest management and around edge effects recommendations to improve potential recovery of forest species, interior forest species?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely sure if I'm understanding what Paul is going for here, but there are a lot of potential issues with forest management and the way that forests are managed. And again, this goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the talk, which is that connectivity is very species specific. And some species are need different forest structure than other species. So there are species that are really going to benefit from increased edges. There are species that are going to benefit from clear cuts. There are species that are going to benefit from having those old growth forests. And, you know, they all use habitat in different ways. And so, you know, forest management tends to be prescriptive rather than adaptive. And so oftentimes there is sort of one size fits all, and they go out there and they clear a forest in one specific way. And so we tend to get benefits for one suite of species and then detriments for a whole lot of others. So there's, you know, there's definitely some issues there. I don't know if I could speak to it any more than that, because of course, you know, I'm not involved in the way that forest management decisions are made. Where we have species of special concern, species of conservation concern, we obviously try to advocate for specific forest practices to benefit those species. But since we aren't managing forests, sometimes there's not a lot we can do.
I would imagine once this project completes and you're able to publish things, Forest Service and other agencies will be able to lean on it to help inform their decisions around those types of things too.
Yeah, that's absolutely the hope.
Yeah. So can you share a bit about how beavers might fit into this program, as many species depend on the habitat that they create?
Yeah, so beaver is one of the 54 species that we selected for this assessment. It was selected to be a riparian surrogate. You know, we know beavers create really high quality habitat for not only other riparian wildlife associates, but for fish as well. And so their needs are absolutely being taken into account, and they are going to be you know, a significant component of that particular habitat association for us.
Okay, and then one more came in here. It says there is a connectivity policy direction 2012 to recovery multiple species on federal lands, and this should link to this effort. So just kind of linking different efforts together. It's kind of just an FYI, I guess, there. Okay. All right, so it looks like that wraps our questions though for today. So thank you everybody for attending, and always great questions. And Rachel, thank you so much again for joining us this morning. It was a pleasure having you and learning more about this project. I look forward to the completion of it or whatnot and seeing kind of what happens with it. And it's exciting to see this project move forward. I anticipate that it will grow over the years as we learn more about what we don't know.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. Everybody have a very good weekend. It's a very blustery weekend out there, so we can kind of hunker down and get cozy. But have a great day, a great weekend, and see you all at the next presentation. Bye-bye.